Between 1948 and 1986, somewhere between 100 and 250 people died at the hands of Richard Leonard Kuklinski, a 6.5, 300-pound contract killer from Jersey City who earned the nickname the Iceman for his method of freezing victims' bodies to disguise their time of death. The confirmed victims numbered at least 100, though Kuklinski himself claimed over 200, and law enforcement suspected the real number fell somewhere in between, a body count so high that even experienced homicide detectives struggled to comprehend how one man could kill so many people over nearly 4 decades without being caught. The method: shootings, stabbings, poisoning, strangulation, beatings, dismemberment, whatever the contract required, or whatever Kuklinski's mood dictated on any given day when someone needed to die. The perpetrator, not a serial killer in the traditional sense, not someone who killed for psychological gratification or sexual pleasure, but a professional, a businessman who viewed murder as a trade, a skill to be perfected and monetized, a job he performed with the same workmanlike efficiency that other men brought to construction or sales. Law enforcement would eventually classify him as one of the most prolific contract killers in American history, a man who worked for multiple crime families simultaneously, who killed for the Mafia when they needed someone eliminated, and who killed independently when opportunities presented themselves or when someone simply annoyed him enough that death seemed like an appropriate response. If you have the courage to hear this story, click here to find out what happened. But I warn you, the details are graphic. This narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that exposed how easily murder can become a profession when a man has no conscience, no empathy, and discovers early in life that he's exceptionally good at killing and that people will pay him to do it. And it reveals the terrifying reality that the most dangerous killers aren't always the ones who make headlines. Sometimes they're the ones who kill quietly, efficiently for money, treating murder like any other job that pays the bills and supports a family in suburban New Jersey where nobody suspects that the big guy who coaches Little League might have killed someone that morning before driving his kids to school. On December 17, 1986, undercover investigators from the New Jersey State Police and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms arrested Richard Kuklinski in the parking lot of a Dumont, New Jersey truck stop, where he'd arrived to finalize what he thought was a deal to purchase cyanide for an upcoming hit. He climbed out of his car, massive, intimidating, wearing a leather jacket despite the December cold, and was immediately surrounded by armed agents who identified themselves and ordered him to the ground. Kuklinski didn't resist. He raised his hands, got on his knees, allowed himself to be cuffed, and said nothing, except to ask for a lawyer. The arrest was anticlimactic after years of investigation, after months of undercover work where an ATF agent named Dominic Polifrone had posed as a fellow criminal and slowly gained Kuklinski's trust until the hitman felt comfortable discussing his work, his methods, his body count. But what made Kuklinski's arrest significant wasn't just that law enforcement had captured a prolific contract killer. It was what they'd learned during the investigation, what Kuklinski had told Polifrone during hours of recorded conversations, what emerged during subsequent interrogations after his arrest. Richard Kuklinski had been killing people for money since the 1950s, had worked as a contract killer for the DeCavalcante crime family and the Gambino family, had murdered over 100 people and possibly more than 200, and had done it all while maintaining a cover life as a suburban family man with a wife, 3 children, a house in Dumont with a white picket fence, and a reputation among neighbors as a guy who was maybe a little rough around the edges, but who clearly loved his kids and kept his lawn maintained and wasn't anybody you'd ever suspect of being one of America's most prolific murderers. The Kuklinski case shattered fundamental assumptions about how communities identify and protect themselves from dangerous individuals. For nearly 40 years, Richard Kuklinski lived in suburban New Jersey, first in Jersey City, later in Dumont, surrounded by neighbors, co-workers, family members, teachers who taught his children, coaches he worked with in youth sports. None of them knew. None of them suspected. The man who killed 100-plus people for money was also the man who attended parent-teacher conferences, who threw backyard barbecues, who waved to neighbors while washing his car on Saturday mornings. This dual existence, contract killer and suburban dad, revealed that the markers communities typically use to identify dangerous people are often useless when the dangerous person is intelligent enough to maintain a facade. Kuklinski wasn't a suspicious loner. He was married, had kids, owned a home, participated in community activities. He didn't fit any profile of a serial killer or career criminal. He was just a big guy with a quick temper who worked in film distribution, his cover story, and who seemed to have enough money despite a job that didn't obviously pay that well. In suburban New Jersey in the 1970s and 80s, nobody asked too many questions about where money came from as long as you maintained your property and didn't cause obvious problems. The impact on community safety was profound once Kuklinski's true nature became public knowledge. His neighbors in Dumont were horrified, traumatized by the realization that they'd lived next door to a mass murderer for years, that their children had played with his children, that they'd invited him to neighborhood gatherings, that they'd trusted him. The betrayal wasn't just that he'd lied. Everyone lies about something. The betrayal was the scale of the deception, the fact that someone could commit over 100 murders while maintaining such a convincing facade of normalcy that nobody suspected anything beyond maybe thinking he was a bit rough, a bit intimidating, maybe involved in something shady, but nothing like mass murder for hire. The financial stakes extended beyond Kuklinski himself. He'd made millions over his career as a contract killer. Estimates ranged from $2 million to over $5 million in total earnings, an enormous sum for someone who'd started life in poverty. But that money was spent, was gone, used to maintain his suburban lifestyle, to support his family, to buy cars and clothes and vacations and all the trappings of middle-class success. His wife Barbara claimed she'd had no idea where the money came from, that Richard had told her he worked in currency exchange and film distribution, that she'd believed him because she'd wanted to believe him, because questioning meant acknowledging suspicions she wasn't ready to confront. After his arrest, the family lost everything. The house was eventually sold, the assets seized, the children's college funds disappeared into legal fees and restitution claims from victims' families. The emotional stakes for Kuklinski's own family were catastrophic. His wife and children had to reconcile the man they'd known, the father who'd coached Little League, who'd taken them to Disney World, who'd been present at birthdays and holidays, with the man the world now knew, a contract killer who'd murdered over 100 people, who'd committed acts of unspeakable violence, who'd lived a double life so complete that his own family had been deceived for decades. His daughter Merrick would later write a book describing the cognitive dissonance of loving her father while knowing what he'd done, of missing him while knowing he'd destroyed so many families, of being simultaneously victim of his deception and beneficiary of his blood money that had funded her childhood. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey, into a family defined by poverty, violence, and dysfunction so extreme it seemed designed to create a killer. His father, Stanley Kuklinski, was an alcoholic who beat his wife and children regularly, who worked sporadically as a railroad brakeman when he wasn't drinking, and who eventually abandoned the family in 1940 when Richard was 5 years old. His mother, Anna McNally, was a devout Catholic who attended church daily while beating her children with broomsticks and belts for infractions, real and imagined, who combined religious fervor with brutal physical punishment in ways that taught young Richard that violence was how adults expressed power and that mercy was weakness. Richard's older brother Florian died under mysterious circumstances when Richard was young, officially from falling down stairs, though family members suspected Anna had beaten him to death and staged the accident. The death was never investigated seriously, just another tragedy in a poor Polish-Irish neighborhood where authorities didn't look too closely at domestic situations unless they absolutely had to. Richard watched his brother die, watched his mother face no consequences, and learned that violence could be hidden, that deaths could be explained away, that the right circumstances allowed you to kill without punishment. Richard grew up in a Polish-Irish neighborhood in Jersey City, poor even by the standards of working-class 1940s New Jersey. He stood out physically from early age. By 13, he was already 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, with hands that were disproportionately large and that he'd learned to use as weapons more effective than most people's fists. His size made him a target for bullies who wanted to prove themselves by taking down the big kid, which meant Richard spent his childhood fighting, learning that violence was how you survived, that hitting first and hitting hard was the only way to avoid being victimized. The neighborhood kids called him Big Rich and targeted him relentlessly, stealing his lunch, pushing him around, mocking his clothes that were threadbare and too small because his mother couldn't afford replacements. Richard endured this abuse for years, internalized it, allowed rage to build inside him while presenting a facade of acceptance. But rage requires outlet, and Richard's outlet came when he was 14 years old. What Richard valued most, even as a child, was respect. Not love. His home life had taught him that love was conditional and often came packaged with violence. Not belonging, he was an outsider in his neighborhood, too big, too angry, too poor even among the poor. What he craved was respect, was the fear he saw in people's eyes when they understood he was dangerous, when they understood that crossing him had consequences. By age 14, Richard had committed his first murder, beating a neighborhood bully named Charlie Lane to death with a wooden pole after years of abuse and humiliation. He dumped the body in a South Jersey pond, told no one, and felt nothing except satisfaction that someone who'd tormented him was gone and would never torment him again. That first murder was a revelation. Richard discovered that killing was easy, that he felt no guilt or remorse, that the psychological barriers that prevented normal people from taking human life simply didn't exist in him. Whether this was the result of genetics, of childhood abuse that had destroyed his capacity for empathy, or of some combination of nature and nurture was irrelevant. By age 14, Richard Kuklinski was a killer who'd learned that murder could solve problems and that he had the temperament to commit murder without the emotional consequences that haunted normal people. Through his teens and early 20s, Richard supported himself through petty crime, robbery, hijacking trucks, stealing cars. He worked the pool hall on Jersey City's east side, where local criminals gathered to discuss jobs and where Richard's size and willingness to use violence made him valuable as muscle for more sophisticated operators. He was arrested several times, but never served significant prison time because witnesses were reluctant to testify against someone so physically intimidating, and because Richard was smart enough to avoid the kinds of high-profile crimes that attracted serious law enforcement attention. He worked alone mostly, didn't join gangs or organized crime families, preferred being independent, not owing anyone, not being responsible to bosses or partners who might become liabilities. Through the pool hall connections, Richard met Roy DeMeo, a soldier in the Gambino crime family who ran a crew that specialized in car theft, loan sharking, and contract killings. DeMeo recognized Richard's potential, the combination of size, intelligence, and complete lack of conscience that made for an ideal enforcer and killer. DeMeo introduced Richard to mob work, starting with collection jobs and beatings, gradually escalating to murder as Richard proved himself reliable and discreet. In 1961, at age 26, Richard married Barbara Pedrici, a secretary from a respectable Italian family who was attracted to Richard's size and toughness and who interpreted his violent potential as protectiveness rather than danger. Barbara would later claim she hadn't known about Richard's criminal activities, that she'd believed his stories about working in currency exchange and film distribution, that she'd been willfully blind to signs that money was coming from illegal sources, because confronting those suspicions would have destroyed the life she wanted to maintain. They married at St. Joseph's Church in Jersey City, had a traditional Catholic ceremony, and began building what appeared from outside to be a normal suburban American family. By the early 1960s, Richard had come to the attention of New Jersey organized crime families who were always looking for reliable people to handle work that required violence. The De Cavalcante crime family, the real-life inspiration for HBO's The Sopranos, approached Richard about doing contract work, about being available when someone needed to be eliminated and when using their own people would create too much exposure. Richard agreed, set his initial rate at $5,000 per hit, approximately $45,000 in today's money, and began a career that would span over 2 decades and result in at least 100 deaths. What distinguished Richard Kuklinski from other contract killers was his professionalism, his willingness to use any method required, and his complete lack of emotional involvement in his work. To Richard, murder wasn't personal, it was business. The victim was just a target, a job, someone who needed to be dead because someone else was paying for them to be dead. He didn't care why, didn't need to know what they'd done, didn't invest any emotional energy in the killing beyond ensuring it was done efficiently and that he wasn't caught. Richard's preferred method was shooting. Simple, quick, effective. He'd use a .22 caliber pistol with a suppressor, would approach the target in parking lots or on street corners, would fire multiple shots to the head at close range, then walk away calmly while the body was still falling. The .22 was perfect for this work. Small, easy to conceal, the subsonic ammunition combined with a good suppressor meant the shots were quiet enough that witnesses wouldn't immediately identify gunfire, and the small bullets would penetrate the skull but wouldn't exit, meaning less blood, less mess, less forensic evidence. Richard explained his preference for the .22 in later interviews. People think you need a big gun, a .45 or a .357. That's Hollywood bullshit. A .22 to the head kills just as dead as any other caliber, and it's quieter, easier to control, easier to conceal. I'd use a Ruger with subsonic rounds and a homemade suppressor. Walk up behind someone, 2 shots to the back of the head, they're down before they know what happened. Then you walk away like nothing happened. Nobody notices a .22 going off. Sounds like a nail gun or a car backfiring. But Richard was flexible, adapting his methods to client specifications and circumstances. If a client wanted a killing to look like an accident, Richard would stage car crashes, tampering with brake lines or steering mechanisms, then following the target until mechanical failure caused a fatal wreck. He'd arrange home invasions that went violently wrong, making murders look like burglaries where victims had resisted and been killed. He understood that the best murders were the ones that didn't look like murders, that disappeared into statistics as accidents or natural deaths that nobody investigated beyond cursory examination. If clients wanted messages sent, wanted other criminals to understand what happened when you stole from certain people or informed to police, Richard would make deaths painful and public. He'd torture victims before killing them, would leave bodies in locations where they'd be found quickly, would mutilate corpses in ways that communicated specific meanings within criminal culture. A body missing hands meant the victim had stolen. Missing tongue meant they'd talked to authorities. These symbolic mutilations were part of Richard's professional repertoire, services he offered at premium rates because they required more time and carried more risk. If clients wanted bodies to disappear completely, when making someone vanish served purposes better than leaving a corpse, Richard would dismember victims using techniques he'd learned working briefly at a meatpacking plant in his 20s. He'd use the same tools butchers used: bone saws, cleavers, fillet knives, and would reduce a human body to manageable pieces in under 2 hours. Disposal methods varied. Sometimes he'd dump pieces in multiple locations across New Jersey and New York, making it impossible to identify victims from partial remains. Sometimes he'd feed remains to rats in abandoned industrial buildings. Richard kept several such locations where rat populations would consume soft tissue in days, leaving only bones that could be scattered or buried with minimal effort. Richard maintained a warehouse in North Bergen, an abandoned industrial space he'd secured through mob connections, where utilities were still connected but where nobody legitimate ever visited. The warehouse became his workshop, the place where messy jobs got done. He'd bring victims there alive when he needed to extract information through torture, would bring corpses there for dismemberment when bodies needed to disappear, would store equipment and supplies that couldn't be kept anywhere connected to his real identity. The warehouse had an industrial freezer, a walk-in unit that still functioned, and this freezer would become the source of Richard's Iceman nickname. Richard also experimented with methods that would disguise time of death, which led to his signature technique. He'd kill someone, wrap the body in plastic sheeting, then store it in the industrial freezer at his warehouse for weeks or months before dumping it where it would be found. When the body thawed and was discovered, decomposition patterns and rigor mortis would be completely disrupted, making it impossible for medical examiners to determine when death had occurred. This time of death confusion meant that Richard's alibis became irrelevant. When police asked where he was when the victim died, Richard could honestly say he'd been somewhere with witnesses, because the victim had actually died weeks earlier when Richard had no alibi, but police didn't know that because the body had been frozen. The freezing technique was brilliant in its simplicity. Medical examiners in the 1970s and early 80s relied heavily on body temperature, rigor mortis, and decomposition patterns to establish time of death. Freezing disrupted all these indicators completely. A body frozen for 3 months would show decomposition patterns consistent with dying weeks ago once thawed, but the actual time of death would be untraceable. Richard used this technique on at least a dozen victims, according to his later confessions, though only a few cases were definitively confirmed through investigation. Richard also used cyanide, a method he claimed to have learned from mob associate Robert Pronge. Cyanide causes almost instant death when administered in sufficient doses. The chemical blocks cells' ability to use oxygen, causing rapid cellular death, particularly in organs with high oxygen demand, like the brain and heart. Richard would dissolve cyanide in a spray bottle, mixed with just enough water to liquefy it, then spray it directly into victims' faces. They'd inhale the cyanide vapor, would collapse within seconds from cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, and would die looking like they'd suffered heart attacks or strokes. Medical examiners who weren't specifically looking for cyanide poisoning would often miss it, especially in older victims or those with pre-existing heart conditions where sudden cardiac death was plausible. The cyanide method was particularly useful for hits that needed to look natural, when clients wanted insurance money or wanted to avoid police investigations that would follow obvious murders. Richard charged premium rates for cyanide hits because the chemical was difficult to obtain, because the method required more planning than simply shooting someone, and because successful natural-looking deaths commanded higher fees in the contract killing market. The efficiency and variety of Richard's methods made him valuable to organized crime. The Mafia families operating in New York and New Jersey in the 1970s and 80s had their own soldiers who could handle violent work, but those soldiers were known to law enforcement, were under surveillance, and using them for every contract created patterns that police could exploit. Richard was different. He wasn't a made member of any family, wasn't on anyone's radar, could be contracted for specific jobs without creating organizational exposure. He was, in mob terminology, an independent contractor, someone they could use when needed without being responsible for his actions or exposed by his arrest if he was ever caught. Richard worked for multiple families simultaneously, primarily the De Cavalcante family in New Jersey and the Gambino family in New York, though he was careful to avoid conflicts of interest. He'd never accept a contract to kill someone connected to another family he worked for, never took jobs that would expose him to mob politics or internal disputes. He was a professional, maintained boundaries, understood that his value lay in being reliable and discreet, not in being involved in the broader criminal enterprises that his clients operated. The money was excellent by working-class standards. Richard's fees ranged from $5,000 per hit in the early years, 1960s, to $50,000 or more for complex jobs by the 1980s. He was averaging 5 to 10 contracts per year at his peak in the late 1970s and early 1980s, generating $200,000, $500,000 annually in an era when the median household income in America was under $25,000. The money allowed him to maintain his suburban lifestyle, to provide for his family in ways his own father never had, to prove to himself and the world that he was successful, even if his success came from killing people for money. The victims of Richard Kuklinski's 4-decade killing spree represented a cross-section of criminal America and innocent people who were simply in the wrong place when Richard decided they needed to die. Many were targets contracted by organized crime families, mob associates who'd become informants, criminals who'd stolen from the wrong people, business owners who'd refused to pay protection money, or who'd become liabilities. These victims knew they were operating in a dangerous world, understood that violence was part of the life they'd chosen, but their knowledge didn't make their deaths less tragic or their families less devastated. One confirmed victim was George Maliband, a mob associate who'd made the mistake of insulting Richard in a bar in North Bergen in 1980. Maliband had been drinking, had been loud and obnoxious, and had made a comment about Richard taking up too much space at the bar, had called him a fat fuck within Richard's hearing. Maliband had no idea he was talking to a contract killer, just thought he was giving attitude to some big guy who was taking up too much space. Richard didn't argue, didn't respond, didn't make a scene. He just finished his drink, paid his tab, went home, got a tire iron from his garage, returned to the bar, and waited in the parking lot. When Maliband left around 1 a.m. drunk and alone, Richard followed him to his car, came up behind him as he fumbled with his keys, and beat him to death with the tire iron, multiple blows to the head and body that continued even after Maliband had collapsed and stopped moving. Richard later said he killed Maliband not because he'd been contracted to, but because he disrespected me, and I don't tolerate disrespect. Nobody calls me a fat fuck and lives. The body was found the next morning in the parking lot. The murder was never solved because nobody connected it to the quiet big guy who'd been at the bar earlier that evening and who'd left hours before the killing. Another victim was Louis Mazgai, a small-time criminal and businessman who'd been involved in bootleg pornography distribution and who'd made connections with mob associates who believed he knew too much about their operations. In July 1981, Mazgai arranged to meet someone to discuss a business deal involving pornographic videos. That someone was Richard, who'd been contracted by mob associates who believed Mazgai was becoming a liability, that he knew details about their operations that made him dangerous, that his continued existence created unacceptable risk. Richard met Mazgai in a parking lot in Little Ferry, New Jersey, engaged him in conversation about the pornography deal, then shot him once in the head with a .25 caliber pistol while Mazgai was looking at sample videos Richard had brought. Richard put Mazgai's body in the trunk of Mazgai's own car, drove to his warehouse in North Bergen, and stored the body in his industrial freezer. For 2 years, Mazgai's frozen corpse remained in that freezer while Richard periodically moved it when he needed the freezer space for other bodies or when he worried about someone discovering his warehouse. Finally, in September 1983, Richard dumped Mazgai's frozen body in Orangetown, Rockland County, New York. When it was discovered by hikers, decomposition and forensic analysis suggested Mazgai had died recently, within the past week or two, based on tissue breakdown and environmental factors. This gave Richard a perfect alibi. In September 1983, he'd been on vacation with his family in Florida, could prove it with hotel receipts and photographs, was nowhere near New York when forensics suggested the murder occurred. The frozen body trick worked perfectly. Police investigated Mazgai's death as a recent murder, looked for suspects who'd been in the area in September 1983, and never connected it to Richard because the time-of-death evidence completely exonerated him. The case remained unsolved until Richard confessed to it in the 1990s and explained how he'd used freezing to manipulate forensic evidence. Robert Pronge, known as Mr. Softy because he operated an ice cream truck as cover for his criminal activities, was another contract killer who worked with Richard occasionally in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Prong was the one who taught Richard the cyanide spray technique, who showed him how to mix the chemical to optimal concentration, how to deliver it so victims inhaled fatal doses, how to make murders look like natural deaths. Prong and Richard developed what passed for friendship in the world of contract killers. They'd meet at diners to discuss methods and share techniques, would occasionally work together on complex jobs that required 2 people, would help each other dispose of bodies or establish alibis when needed. But in 1984, Pronge became a liability. He was drinking heavily, was talking too much in bars about jobs he'd done, was attracting attention from other criminals who worried his loose lips would bring law enforcement scrutiny that would expose everyone he'd worked with. Richard was approached by mob associates, possibly De Cavalcante family members, though Richard later refused to specify who'd contracted the hit, to eliminate Pronge. The job made Richard uncomfortable. Prong was the closest thing to a friend Richard had in his professional life, was someone Richard actually respected for his skill and professionalism. But business was business, and Richard had learned long ago not to let personal feelings interfere with work. Richard arranged to meet Pronge, told him he had a job opportunity, met him at a diner in Saddlebrook, New Jersey. While they talked, Richard excused himself to use the restroom, but instead went to his car, retrieved a cyanide spray bottle, returned to the booth, and sprayed Pronge directly in the face while pretending to show him something. Pronge collapsed almost immediately, fell forward onto the table, died within a minute from the same cyanide method he'd taught Richard years earlier. Richard walked out calmly, drove away, and later learned that Pronge's death had been ruled a heart attack by medical examiners who found no obvious signs of foul play, and who didn't test for cyanide because they had no reason to suspect poisoning. Richard appreciated the irony while feeling nothing about betraying someone who'd trusted him. Some victims were completely innocent, people who crossed Richard in minor ways, who annoyed him in traffic, who argued with him about parking spaces or made comments he interpreted as disrespectful. Richard would sometimes follow these people home, would learn their routines, and would kill them days or weeks later when opportunity presented itself and when he felt like exercising his power because he could, because someone had disrespected him, and because Richard had decided that disrespect required death. These murders weren't contracted, weren't profitable, were simply Richard exercising his power because he could, because someone had disrespected him, and because Richard had decided that disrespect required death. One such victim was a pharmacist named Peter Calabro, who'd refused to fill a prescription for Barbara Kuklinski, Richard's wife, because of some bureaucratic issue with the prescription. Either it was expired, or the dosage seemed questionable, or the doctor's signature looked irregular. Calabro was following pharmacy regulations, doing his job responsibly, but Richard interpreted the refusal as disrespect toward his wife, which meant disrespect toward him. Richard didn't confront Calabro that day. He just noted the man's name from his badge, left the pharmacy, and began planning. Several days later, Richard returned to the pharmacy near closing time, watched Calabro lock up and walk to his car in the parking lot, followed him from a distance as Calabro drove home to his apartment in Clifton, New Jersey. Richard memorized the route, noted where Calabro parked, observed the apartment building's layout and security. 2 weeks later, Richard waited for Calabro in the parking garage, approached him as he was unlocking his car after work, and shot him twice in the head with a .22 pistol equipped with a suppressor. Calabro died instantly, fell between his car and the one parked next to it, wasn't discovered until the next morning. The murder was never solved, never connected to Richard, was just another unsolved homicide in 1970s New Jersey, where violent crime was common and clearance rates were low. Richard later confessed to this murder during his prison interviews, explained his reasoning. "He disrespected my wife. That means he disrespected me. Nobody disrespects me. I don't care if you're a pharmacist or a priest or whatever. You show me disrespect, you die. That's the rule." The total victim count remains uncertain. Richard himself claimed over 200 murders in various interviews after his arrest, though law enforcement could only confirm approximately 100 based on evidence and credible testimony. The discrepancy might reflect Richard exaggerating to enhance his reputation, or it might reflect the reality that many of his victims were criminals whose disappearances were never reported to police, whose bodies were never found, whose families assumed they'd fled or been killed by other criminals, and never pushed for investigations. Given Richard's career spanning nearly 4 decades, given his admission to averaging 5 to 10 contracts per year at his peak, plus additional non-contracted murders committed when people annoyed him, A total count exceeding 100 is entirely plausible, even if exact numbers will never be known. What made Richard Kuklinski particularly terrifying wasn't just his body count, but his ability to maintain a completely separate existence as a suburban family man who attended his children's school functions and coached Little League while simultaneously working as one of America's most prolific contract killers. Richard's wife, Barbara, would later claim she had no idea about his real work, that she'd believed his stories about currency exchange and film distribution, that she'd questioned where money came from, but had accepted his explanations because she wanted to believe them. Critics argued Barbara must have known. How could you live with someone for over 25 years, share a bed and a life, and not know they were a mass murderer? But domestic violence experts and psychologists who studied the case suggested Barbara was a classic battered woman, someone who'd been conditioned through years of physical and emotional abuse to avoid asking questions that might trigger Richard's rage. She'd learned early in their marriage that certain topics were forbidden, that pressing Richard about his work or his whereabouts or his associates would result in violence, not the extreme violence he used professionally, but enough to reinforce that curiosity had painful consequences. Richard was violent at home, though he later claimed he never hit his wife or children with the same intensity he used in his professional work. "I had rules," he told HBO documentarian Gabby Monet during interviews conducted in the 1990s while he was in prison. "I never hit my family in the face, never broke bones. That was for work. At home, I just needed them to understand I was in charge. That disrespect had consequences. A slap, a shove, maybe a punch to the body if they really pushed me. But I never beat them the way I beat people for work. That was different. That was business." This rule was cold comfort to a family that lived in terror of Richard's explosive temper, that learned to read his moods and adjust their behavior accordingly, that understood that Daddy's anger was a constant threat that required careful management. His children grew up in a household where Daddy was loving one moment and terrifying the next, where Christmas mornings with presents and laughter could be followed by evenings where Richard would rage about some minor infraction and put his fist through walls or throw furniture. The children learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to avoid attracting their father's attention when he was in one of his moods. They had no idea their father was killing people for money. They just knew he was scary, that he needed to be managed carefully, that their mother protected them as best she could, but that ultimately they were all at Richard's mercy. His daughter Merrick would later describe growing up in the Kuklinski household as walking on eggshells constantly, never knowing which version of Dad you'd get, the one who'd take you for ice cream and tell jokes, or the one who'd explode over nothing and make you wish you could disappear. Richard maintained separate storage units and warehouses where he kept his professional equipment, weapons, restraints, plastic sheeting, cleaning supplies, the industrial freezer he used for bodies, his collection of firearms and knives and tools that had no legitimate purpose beyond killing and dismembering human beings. He was meticulous about separating his professional and personal lives, never bringing work home in any obvious way, never discussing contracts or methods where family could overhear, never storing anything at the house in Dumont that could connect him to his murders. In his mind, he was protecting his family, was keeping them separate from the violence that defined his professional existence. In reality, he was exposing them to a man capable of extreme violence, who could explode at any moment, who had killed over 100 people, and who could just as easily kill them if his rage or paranoia turned inward. The compartmentalization was extraordinary. Richard could kill someone in the morning, would wake up, have breakfast with his family, kiss his wife goodbye, drive to a meeting that he'd told Barbara was about his currency exchange business, shoot someone in a parking lot, clean up any blood spatter, dispose of the weapon in a storm drain or river, then drive home in time for dinner, help his kids with homework, and watch television as if he'd spent the day doing ordinary work. There was no transition period, no visible difference between Richard the Killer and Richard the Father. He simply turned off one persona and activated the other, moving between them as easily as changing clothes. This ability to compartmentalize completely, to commit acts of extreme violence, and then immediately engage in normal family activities without any visible emotional disruption, was perhaps Richard's most terrifying characteristic, more than his body count or his methods. It demonstrated a complete absence of normal human conscience, a psychological landscape so alien that even forensic psychiatrists who studied him struggled to understand how someone could function this way. Neighbors in Dumont remembered Richard as a guy who was maybe a little rough, a little intimidating, but who clearly loved his kids. He'd coach Little League Baseball for his son's team, would show up at games and practices, would yell encouragement from the sidelines like any other dad. He'd throw backyard barbecues in summer, would invite neighbors over, would grill burgers and hot dogs, would drink beer and talk about sports and complain about taxes like everyone else in suburban New Jersey. He'd help neighbors with heavy lifting, would help them move furniture or carry appliances, would use his size and strength for community purposes, would be the guy you'd call if you needed something heavy, moved because he was massive and strong and never said no when asked for help. Nobody suspected anything beyond maybe thinking Richard was involved in something shady, maybe bookmaking or loan sharking or some other low-level organized crime activity that was common in New Jersey and that neighbors could overlook as long as it didn't affect them directly. His cover story about working in currency exchange and film distribution was vague enough to be plausible, but specific enough to explain irregular hours and occasional large sums of cash. When Richard would disappear for a day or two, off to commit a murder somewhere, he'd tell Barbara he had to travel for business, had to handle currency exchanges in other cities, had meetings with film distributors. She'd accept these explanations because questioning them meant confronting suspicions she wasn't prepared to handle, meant potentially discovering truths that would destroy the life she'd built, meant acknowledging that the father of her children might be something far darker than a small-time criminal. The cognitive dissonance for people who knew Richard, how could this family man be a mass murderer, reflected a broader truth about how humans categorize danger. We expect monsters to look like monsters, to act in ways that mark them as different and threatening. Richard didn't fit those expectations. He was a guy with a family and a house and a lawnmower, someone who existed within normal suburban structures in ways that made him invisible despite his size and his intimidating presence. The disguise wasn't elaborate. He didn't create a fake identity or invent a complex cover story. He just lived normally, and normal was sufficient camouflage because nobody looks at suburban dads coaching Little League and thinks mass murderer for hire. Richard Kuklinski came to law enforcement's attention gradually, through multiple investigations that slowly converged on his name over years of patient detective work. He wasn't initially a suspect in any specific murder. He was just a name that kept appearing in different contexts, in witness statements about mob associates, in surveillance of organized crime figures, in tips from informants who mentioned a big guy from Jersey who did contract work and who had a reputation for being reliable and discreet. The New Jersey State Police and federal ATF began investigating Richard seriously in the mid-1980s after an informant named Percy House, a criminal Richard had worked with on several occasions, provided information identifying Richard as someone involved in multiple murders and in weapons trafficking. But building a prosecutable case was extremely difficult. Richard was careful, rarely left evidence at crime scenes, had no significant criminal history that would make him an obvious suspect in murders, and benefited from the fact that many of his victims were criminals themselves, people whose families didn't push for investigations, whose deaths were written off as mob-related violence and filed as unsolved homicides that nobody expected to close. The breakthrough came when Deputy Attorney General of New Jersey, Robert J. Carroll, decided that the only way to build a case against Richard was to use an undercover agent who could gain his trust and gather direct evidence of his willingness to commit murder and his admissions about past killings. The job went to Dominic Polifrone, an ATF agent with experience in undercover work, who was given a new identity as a fellow criminal looking for reliable people to work with. Polifrone's infiltration took months of patient, methodical work. He couldn't approach Richard directly. That would arouse suspicion immediately. Instead, Polifrone built a criminal persona through a series of staged scenarios that gradually brought him into Richard's orbit. He'd appear at bars and social clubs where mob associates gathered, would be introduced through mutual acquaintances who'd been cultivated by law enforcement, would gradually establish credibility through small deals, buying stolen goods, arranging low-level criminal activities that demonstrated he was legitimate and that made Richard's associates comfortable vouching for him. The first meeting between Polifrone and Richard occurred in September 1986 at a diner in North Jersey. Polifrone had been introduced by a mob associate as Dominic the Polak, a guy from Pennsylvania who was connected and who might need some work done. Richard was cautious initially, spoke carefully, asked questions designed to test whether Polifrone was legitimate or law enforcement. Polifrone handled the interrogation perfectly. His cover story held up. His knowledge of criminal operations was detailed enough to be convincing, and his references checked out through the mob associates who'd been carefully cultivated to vouch for him. Over the next 3 months, Polifrone and Richard met dozens of times, at diners, in bars, in parking lots where they'd sit in cars and talk. Polifrone wore a wire to every meeting, recording conversations that gradually revealed Richard's true nature. The approach was subtle. Polifrone never directly asked, "Have you killed people?" or "Will you commit murder for me?" Those kinds of direct questions would have sent Richard running. Instead, Polifrone would discuss hypothetical situations, would mention that he knew people who sometimes needed problems solved permanently, would make vague references to violence, and gauge Richard's reactions. Richard eventually began opening up, began discussing his work in terms that made clear he was talking about contract killing, even though he rarely used explicit language. He'd talk about taking care of problems and making people disappear and handling situations permanently. He'd discuss methods in abstract terms, talking about the virtues of different caliber weapons, about disposal techniques, about how to stage deaths to look like accidents or natural causes. And as he grew more comfortable with Polifrone, Richard began bragging, began providing details about past jobs that demonstrated his experience and skill. In one recorded conversation from November 1986, Richard discussed his freezing technique. "You got to understand time of death. That's how they catch people. They know when the guy died. They check who was where. They build timelines. But what if you control when they think he died? You kill him Monday, you freeze him, you dump him Thursday. Medical examiner says he died Wednesday. You got an alibi for Wednesday, case closed. It's simple when you understand how the system works." In another conversation, Richard discussed cyanide. "It's beautiful, man. They breathe it, they go down, looks like a heart attack. Unless they specifically test for it, and they usually don't because why would they? It just looks natural. I've done it maybe a dozen times. Nobody ever caught it. You know why? Because they're not looking for it. Guy's 50, 60 years old, drops dead, heart attack, case closed. They don't run expensive toxicology tests on every heart attack victim. These recordings were gold. Direct admissions from Richard about methods and past murders, confessions that could be used in court, even though Richard hadn't explicitly said, "I killed these specific people." The conversations established Richard's knowledge, his experience, his willingness to discuss murder in ways that demonstrated he was a professional killer. The final phase of the operation came in December 1986, when Polifrone told Richard he had a contract, someone who needed to be killed, and that he needed Richard's help acquiring cyanide to make it look like a natural death. Richard agreed to source the cyanide through his mob connections, arranged to purchase it for $3,000, and agreed to meet Polifrone on December 17th at a truck stop in Dumont to complete the transaction. On December 17, 1986, at approximately 5:30 p.m., Richard drove to the Vince Lombardi service area on the New Jersey Turnpike, where he thought he was meeting Polifrone to finalize the cyanide purchase. Instead, he found himself surrounded by armed law enforcement, New Jersey State Police, ATF agents, local police providing backup. Richard's arrest was quiet, professional, anticlimactic after months of investigation. He raised his hands, complied with orders to exit the vehicle and kneel, allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. His only words were, "I want a lawyer." Inside Richard's car, investigators found the cyanide he'd acquired for Polifrone, approximately $3,000 worth of pure cyanide powder in sealed containers, enough to kill dozens of people. They also found weapons, maps of New Jersey and New York with locations marked that would later be confirmed as disposal sites for bodies, and notes about surveillance of potential targets. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and combined with the recorded conversations from Polifrone's undercover work, formed the basis for charges that would ensure Richard Kuklinski never walked free again. Richard Kuklinski was tried and convicted of 5 murders, the cases where evidence was strongest and where prosecutors felt confident they could secure convictions beyond reasonable doubt. The victims in the trial were George Maliband, Louis Masgay, Gary Smith, Daniel Deppner, and Paul Hoffman. 5 men out of the 100-plus Richard had likely killed, but 5 cases where forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Richard's own recorded admissions created unassailable proof of guilt. The trial took place in New Jersey Superior Court in 1988. The prosecution presented the undercover recordings, testimony from Dominic Polifrone about his months infiltrating Richard's confidence, forensic evidence linking Richard to murder scenes, and testimony from mob associates who'd been granted immunity in exchange for describing how Richard worked as a contract killer. Richard's defense was minimal. His attorneys couldn't dispute the evidence, couldn't explain away the recordings, couldn't provide alibis that held up against forensic timelines. They attempted to argue that Richard was being scapegoated for organized crime murders that others had committed, but this defense collapsed under the weight of Richard's own words on the recordings describing methods and details that only the killer would know. On March 5, 1988, after a trial lasting 6 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 5 murder counts. Judge Frederick Kuchenmeister sentenced Richard to 2 consecutive life terms plus 30 years, ensuring he'd die in prison, ensuring that a man who'd killed over 100 people would never threaten anyone again. But the trial convictions represented a tiny fraction of Richard's actual body count. After his conviction, Richard began talking. partly because he enjoyed the attention, partly because prison boredom made discussing his career a form of entertainment, and partly because he seemed to genuinely want some form of recognition for what he considered his professional accomplishments, even if those accomplishments were over 100 murders committed over 4 decades. In interviews with psychiatrists, law enforcement, and HBO documentarians who produced 2 documentaries about him in the 1990s and early 2000s, Richard provided details about dozens of additional murders. He described victims, methods, locations, circumstances. Some of these confessions were corroborated when bodies were found where he said they'd be, or when details matched unsolved cases, though many couldn't be verified because bodies had been too thoroughly destroyed or disposed of, or because the murders had occurred so long ago that evidence no longer existed. In one particularly chilling interview segment that appeared in HBO's 1991 documentary, The Iceman Tapes, Conversations with a Killer, Richard was asked by psychiatrist Park Dietz whether he felt any remorse for his victims. Richard paused, appeared to genuinely consider the question, then responded, "No, I don't feel bad about it. They were contracts. They were work. Do you feel bad about the work you do? No, it's just what you do. That's how I felt about killing. It was just my job. Some people sell insurance. I killed people. Same thing. You provide a service. You get paid. The only difference is your service is legal and mine wasn't. But morally, no difference. They needed killing. I killed them. End of story." This complete absence of remorse, this treatment of murder as morally equivalent to any other profession, demonstrated the depth of Richard's psychological abnormality. Forensic psychiatrists who examined him concluded he was a psychopath, someone with no capacity for empathy, no conscience, no emotional connection to the suffering of others. He understood intellectually that killing was wrong in the sense that society prohibited it, but he felt no moral or emotional barrier to murder, viewed victims as objects rather than people, and experienced no guilt or remorse regardless of how many he killed or how brutal the methods. Richard Kuklinski died in prison on March 5, 2006, at Trenton State Prison in New Jersey. He was 70 years old. The cause of death was chronic inflammation of blood vessels, a condition possibly exacerbated by decades of stress and violence, though officially attributed to natural causes. Richard's family, his wife Barbara and his adult children, did not attend any funeral service. His body was cremated, and his ashes went unclaimed for months before eventually being scattered in an undisclosed location by prison officials. The impact of Richard Kuklinski's crimes extended far beyond his confirmed victims. Over 100 families lost loved ones to a man who viewed murder as a profession, who killed with the same emotional investment that other people brought to filing taxes or mowing lawns or any other routine task. The psychological trauma for his own family, his wife and children who'd lived with a mass murderer for decades without knowing it, was profound and permanent. Barbara Kuklinski spent the rest of her life grappling with guilt, with questions about what she'd known or suspected and chosen to ignore, with the realization that the money that funded her comfortable suburban life had come from over 100 murders. She died in 2013, never having fully resolved those questions or fully healed from the betrayal of discovering that the man she'd lived with for over 25 years had been one of America's most prolific killers. Richard's children struggled with their father's legacy, loving the man who'd been their father, who'd coached their sports teams and attended their school functions, while hating the monster he'd been to so many others. His daughter Merrick wrote a memoir titled The Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer, describing the cognitive dissonance of simultaneously missing her father and being horrified by what he'd done, of understanding that her childhood had been funded by blood money, that every birthday present and Christmas gift and family vacation had been paid for with money earned from killing people. If you found this story compelling about how murder became a profession for one man over 4 decades, like and subscribe to see more deep dives into true crime cases that expose the darkest aspects of human nature. Share this video with anyone interested in understanding how someone can kill over 100 people while maintaining a facade of suburban normalcy that fooled everyone from neighbors to family. Comment below. At what point does childhood abuse stop being an explanation for becoming a mass murderer? Could someone like Richard Kuklinski operate today with modern forensics, surveillance technology, and DNA analysis that didn't exist during his killing career? Because these questions matter. The psychological dynamics that enabled Richard Kuklinski, the complete lack of empathy, the ability to compartmentalize extreme violence from normal family life, the treatment of murder as business rather than personal, continue to exist in human psychology. Contract killers still operate, still work for organized crime, still kill for money in America and around the world. The methods have evolved with technology, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Some people can kill without remorse, can treat human life as a commodity to be bought and sold, can murder 100+ times over decades and feel nothing except professional satisfaction at work well done and money well earned. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're the big guy coaching Little League, waving to neighbors while mowing his lawn, taking his kids to Disney World, and tucking them into bed at night. Sometimes they're the man who killed someone that morning before breakfast, who has over 100 murders on his conscience, except he has no conscience, who views your life as worth exactly whatever someone will pay him to end it. Richard Kuklinski killed over 100 people while maintaining a suburban family life for decades because nobody looked at suburban dads and suspected mass murder. His story reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it just parks in your driveway, offers to help you carry that heavy box inside, and you never realize you're talking to someone who's killed more people than most serial killers combined. The Iceman wasn't a nickname. It was a perfect description of a man whose heart was as frozen as the bodies he stored, who killed for money with the same emotional detachment that you or I might bring to any ordinary day at work.